Thank you everybody for attending today. We have a wonderful session. This is our third speaker seminar provided through our Innovate network, and we want to recognize the Government of Canada for funding Innovate through their Strategic Innovation Fund. So that everybody knows, the lectures will be recorded and will be available with French subtitles. We have a YouTube channel and playlist with the previous two webinars, and this one will be posted early next week. And the URL for that will be posted in the chat. The format for this lecture is a 45 to 50-minute talk, followed by a Q&A session. Please use the Q&A option that exists in the Zoom webinar, as the chat is not moderated. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Engbers. He is the CEO and co-founder of Cohesic Inc. Dr. Engbers completed his doctorate in neuroscience at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute at the University of Calgary, where he applied computational and machine learning techniques to understand the computational properties of neurons. Following his graduate studies, he joined the clinical research unit at the University of Calgary as a clinical data scientist, during which time he operationalized large administrative data sets on distributed computing platforms, developed predictive clinical models using machine learning, and developed web-based clinical decision tools. He formed Cohesic with Dr. James White after recognizing the barriers to the development and deployment of AI tools within healthcare, which I think is an issue that many of us face. Their solution to these problems is Cohesic DI, a decision intelligence platform that provides intelligence, infrastructure, and decision support tools to advance cardiovascular imaging services. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Jordan.
Excellent. Raphael, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to give this lecture in the Innovate lecture series. It really is an honor to have that invitation. Rafa, that was already a great introduction, so I don't need to say too much more about my background, but I did want to kind of emphasize some of the issues that I observed kind of during my postdoctoral studies before forming Cohesic, and really kind of what instigated me leaving academia and deciding to tackle these issues in industry. So what I observed, again, this is around 2013, which was when a lot of the machine learning and big data technologies were coming out of Silicon Valley, and everyone was very excited to apply those to healthcare. But I observed a gap between the research we were doing, which was implementing and creating machine learning models, and the actual ability to put those into practice. And it caused me to begin looking into what those barriers are, which is what we'll discuss today. And in the lecture today, I'll be focusing actually a lot on kind of failures of applying AI in clinical practice. Not for some weird Schadenfreude, desire to look at people's misery, as much as I find that the failures are a little bit more insightful and informative than looking at successes. So without further ado, let's begin. So again, around the time that I moved into clinical data science, in 2011, Watson had just, destroyed humans on Jeopardy, as the headlines read, and was ready to take on cancer care in collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I think probably a lot of us remember this. And the headlines in the news was that within about a year or two, Watson was going to be providing value to the hospitals and begin helping to personalize treatment pathways. And this was exciting news, and also a little daunting, as we looked at the field, because it seemed like perhaps, IBM Watson out of the gate was already beginning to address big major issues. And IBM, of course, was a giant player in this space. But let's fast forward 6 years. What we actually saw was probably a headline that I don't think any company wants to see. IBM Watson gave unsafe recommendations for treating cancer. Again, this was 6 years later. And an unfortunate comment from customers that were released in documents, kind of internal documents from IBM. And this should cause us to kind of pause and ask a couple questions. I mean, it's one thing to kind of look and say perhaps there was some hubris around what they could accomplish with IBM Watson, and maybe the medical industry is a little bit more difficult than Jeopardy. But maybe there's something a little bit more insightful we can pull from this. And I think it causes, what we have to ask is, IBM is a giant company with a lot of very smart people who have actually met. And they had a lot of resources. So what is it that caused them to fail here? Because I do think that IBM Watson is really just a highly visible example of a much larger problem that we face. Taking a step back, maybe away from healthcare, and just looking at data science in general and its application compared to the promise, what we see is that about 85% of data science projects fail, and by which I mean they fail to make it into production, or they don't deliver on business objectives. And I think we have to ask, are we any better in healthcare? I could not find quantitative data around this, but if you begin to look through literature and opinions, you do begin to see comments like this. So this quote followed a large number of paragraphs that listed all of the research studies that were successful or created highly performant models using things like deep learning to examine EHR records and images that were all very successful models in research. But this is the quote from this paper published in 2019. Given this impressive array of studies, it is perhaps surprising that real-world deployments of machine learning algorithms in clinical practice are rare. Despite this, we believe that AI will have a positive impact on many aspects of medicine. Now, what caught my attention here is perhaps the disjointed nature of those two sentences, where the first seems to indicate that there's a large problem, and yet the second has this, of course, very hopeful, optimistic viewpoint. And I think it's, again, behooves us to kind of pause and look at that first section and ask, really, why is it so difficult to implement AI in clinical practice? Is there something special about the healthcare industry? Is there something about the problems that we're trying to face or the environments we're trying to deploy those in? And this is really the question that drove me to co-found Cohesic with James White, to begin to address these three barriers that I'm going to discuss now with some examples of or illustrations of where these barriers have been seen. So the first barrier, where's the data? This is a very fundamental issue. Data is, of course, key to the development of any AI tool. For point of reference, every time I use AI in this talk, please feel free to mentally substitute machine learning, because that is the main approach that we take in creating AI tools. But regardless, when we talk about AI development, of course, we really do need large amounts of high quality data. This was a report published by McKinsey Global Institute in 2017 that identified that one of the biggest potential bottlenecks that could inhibit or derail AI development in healthcare is the availability of sufficient qualities of high quality data in standardized formats. I don't think this should be a surprise to anyone, but I think we have to ask the question, how do we get access to these large data sets? And is there some sort of inherent limitation that we need to begin to address on maybe a more systematic or systemic scale? So I understand this is an introductory lecture series, so I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. So I am going to have a couple slides that provide some very introductory information about machine learning. This is one of them. So if you are, an AI wizard, this will be no news to you, but just make sure we're on the same page. Let's take a step back here. So broadly speaking, there are two categories of machine learning algorithms. We can call them supervised and unsupervised. While unsupervised algorithms certainly have a lot of potential, we're not going to talk about those today. We're going to be focusing more on the supervised machine learning, which is, I would say, the vast majority of approaches used today in healthcare. So supervised machine learning really just means that you have a data set where you have the outcome, or in this case, let's say a variable you want to predict. You know what the outcome was. You have a gold standard that you are trying to use, or that you're using as a reference point for evaluating the performance of your model and use it to train it. So, of course, if we're talking about machine learning, we can't avoid a cat's example for cat images. Of course, since this is a healthcare focused one, you could substitute that for cancer, which would certainly be less fun and a lot more sad. But for example, if you did have a data set of images, say mammograms that potentially contain cancerous masses, what you would want to do is have a data set where those have been labeled, where you've identified which ones contain those masses. You run that through a machine learning algorithm, which will essentially compare the prediction of a model to the label, the expected outcome, determine what the error is, and adjust the model's parameters to try to improve its performance, predicted performance. And in the second stage, you want to have a set of data that has not been used for training that you then test against to determine its performance. So that's all the background we really need for this discussion. So we'll kind of move forward from there. Really, the point is that this sort of approach does require large amounts of labeled data, and accurately labeled data, I think, is also important. So in healthcare, we have to ask the question, where does the labeled data come from? You know, summer students, those may perhaps dreaded projects of going back through records to identify what was written in that report so that we know what happened to that patient. Maybe grad students who have to spend long hours circling images, you know, drawing circles and images to identify contours of the heart. Or maybe from doctors, from the EHR, and we try to rely on that data with all perhaps the inherent data quality issues that go along with administrative data. This is actually a problem that exists well beyond healthcare. And there's been, you know, over the last few years, quite a few articles discussing this unseen labor force, which is involved in labeling data sets for any number of purposes. And every time you do one of those CAPTCHA kind of quizzes online where you have to find every stop sign in the set of 9 images, you are helping a machine learning algorithm train by labeling the data. So again, just taking a pause and looking at how we could apply this to, say, image-guided therapy or other areas of clinical practice we're interested in, we really have to start at the very basics and say, do we have the data available? How can we label it, and how can we ensure that those labels are accurate? And I think coming back from there, it's important to ask, can we create platforms or new sorts of systems that allow us to just capture that sort of data in the course of clinical care, so that we can then see kind of or accelerate our development of AI and its application into practice. So this does, kind of bring us to a question. Well, how is it that Google and all these other large internet companies were so successful at the application of AI within their own industries? And again, this kind of goes back to the point I just mentioned about creating systems that generate this data inherently. So every time someone interacts with, for example, the Google ecosystem, well, that's a digital interaction where users are being tracked, and all of that data is essentially labeled. In fact, they were collecting so much data, they had a term called data exhaust, literally data that they had no idea what to do with until someone started applying machine learning approaches to it and began to realize that it's actually valuable. This is a diagram from Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it's an interesting book. I recommend reading it to get an interesting perspective on maybe some of the effects of these prediction tools we're creating. But what she points out is that the traditional behavior is kind of in this bottom diamond here of this diagram, where users interact with services, behavioral data is collected, that goes through an analytics process where we begin to improve services, a very straightforward interaction. But because, again, Google and these tech companies control these ecosystems and we're tracking huge amounts of data that's automatically labeled, they could apply machine learning approaches to develop prediction products that allows them to predict future behavior and collect essentially revenue on that surplus value. Now, this is essentially what we should want for healthcare, but in a of course, an altruistic way of wanting to improve patient outcomes, by saying, can we create systems that allow us to actually capture patients' health data in a way that is scalable, that is accurate, that is labeled and appropriate for machine learning. And if we can do that, then I think we can stand a better chance of success in deploying AI tools and developing additional ones. So right now, I would argue that this approach has definitely not transferred into healthcare, this approach of collecting this high quality data, largely due to fragmentation within the healthcare technology ecosystem, the complexity of healthcare and diseases, and lagging technology as well. And these are just sort of inherent to the environment we're in, but they do cause issues. So here's one of the first examples I wanted to bring up. This was a paper published in 2019 by DeepMind in Nature about an algorithm they had developed, a machine learning algorithm they had developed to predict future acute kidney injury. And this had fantastic performance. For severe cases, they were touting that they had about a 90% accuracy. Less so for less severe cases, but it was still, a major milestone, and certainly something that was addressing an important clinical problem. Of course, headlines started coming out not that far after, pointing out that actually there were problems with the data sets in relation to the claim that this was a generalizable tool. The data they had used was on about 700,000 US veterans, 93% were male. So if this was a tool to predict injury within a male population, I would say this is very successful. For a generalizable tool, this is an issue. But again, it's important for us to kind of pause and take a step back and say, well, was it that DeepMind didn't understand the issues with their data? Or was it perhaps that it's actually just very difficult to obtain high quality representative population scale data sets that are appropriate for machine learning? So of course, I would say that the limitations of the algorithm are certainly important to understand, but the larger lesson we can learn here is that in order to achieve our goals, we need to find ways to collect high quality data in scalable ways. And that might be something we have to do looking 5 or 10 years in the future of how we collect it going forward. That just might be the reality as well. And I promise towards the end, I'll provide a bit of a positive note as well in terms of where I do see that we can, we have some approaches here. I'm not going to just be completely cynical throughout this, but again, I think it's important for us to really understand these real world barriers. Which brings us to our next barrier. What is the real performance of your algorithm? And I think this is a really important barrier, one that I think that is at the top of people's minds. If we look at this article by Keen and Topol in 2018, they identify this AI chasm, that is the gulf between developing a scientifically sound algorithm and its use in any meaningful real world application. And I think this is certainly an important question for us to address. So again, I'm going to take a step back here and maybe provide a bit of background around machine learning. For those of you who are maybe not as familiar with issues of generalizability. I've used that term when discussing the previous barrier. Essentially, it just means how well is your algorithm going to perform when you begin to apply it to an unknown and different data sets. So you've developed a model within your lab on your data sets. If you go to a different hospital, to a different country, to a different population, is it going to perform as well as your research showed? So there are some terms here which are important. Let's start on the left-hand side with the concept of high variance and overfitting. So variance refers to essentially how much does your performance change as you move from one data set to the other. So at the bottom here, you can see a very typical example of how you divide up data sets when you're training an ML model. This would be something you would see in any standard textbook, where you should split off a section of your data as a test data set that should never be used to train your data. It's only used to assess performance at the end. You have the rest of your data split into a training data set, which is used to train the model, and then a validation data set used to assess performance. And of course, you can do things like k-fold cross-validation to do this repeatedly and mix up the data, bootstrapping, variety of approaches there to try to maximize the utility of the data that you have. Now, going back to the top diagram, what we see on the left-hand side is an overfit model. So what this means is, this is, for example, let's take a decision tree learning algorithm. If you try to just maximize performance, what's going to happen is that particular algorithm has high variance. It's going to actually learn all of the nuances of that particular data set to the point where it's going to have very good performance. But as soon as you show it a novel test data set or somewhere, go somewhere else, you're going to see a massive decrease in performance. So that difference between your training performance and test performance is really a measure of the variance. So we want to avoid that. Again, lots of methods to look at that. I won't go into those today. In the middle diagram, we see, on the other hand, kind of the opposite, an underfitting example, where a model essentially just doesn't perform well. But it doesn't perform well in both the training and the test. And so it has low variance, but a high bias, essentially a high error rate. So in this case, you see a straight line being fit to what obviously should be a curve. So obviously our goal is to try to find the balance between low bias and low variance that's going to allow us, when we go into a new environment, to retain that performance when it's exposed to novel data. So all of that, again, is just kind of basic background information. Hopefully some people find that useful. What I want to talk about, though, is maybe a few more subtle problems that are not discussed as much, at least in my experience. So one of these is what's called data leakage. So data leakage happens when the outcome you are trying to predict, there are features. Again, the features are the variables that you are using to try and predict that outcome. This happens when some of those features actually contain information about the outcome that they really should not be available to the learner. So this is where maybe you break temporality in your data set. And I'll go through an example here, but the most maybe simple way of explaining this would be, if you included the outcome in your set of features by accident, you forgot to remove it from that matrix. Well, now you have, again, data leakage in that you've literally included the outcome. And obviously the machine learning model, they're both smart and dumb. It's smart in that it's going to realize that feature is highly predictive of your outcome. It is dumb in that it doesn't realize that it shouldn't be using that because, again, that shouldn't be there. But I'm going to go talk about a bit more of a subtle example, which I found interesting. This was from a data mining competition in 2008, looking at cancer detection. And one thing that was observed was that the patient ID was somehow highly correlated with the cancer outcome. And this was puzzling until they began to look at how they constructed the data set. And what they realized was that the IDs were assigned consecutively, and they were consigned source by source. So you can imagine hospital 1 providing patients, 1 to 100, hospital 2, 101 to 200. And what happened is essentially that, that means the source was not obfuscated. So if some of those sites happened to be cancer centers, where the patient essentially was sent there because they already had a diagnosis, then that was highly predictive of course, the cancer outcome. And so while, of course, we would say, well, we would never use the patient ID as a predictor, that's silly, it does point to the subtlety of this data leakage problem, where you could actually get a very high-performing model, but it's an artifact of how the data set is constructed. And then when you go into the real world, all of a sudden you see the performance completely drop off because patient IDs are signed differently, for example. Now, let's maybe look at something a bit more real world that came out recently. Back to my old stomping grounds of neuroscience. This paper was published, or researchers from Purdue University published this research showing that the sets of studies that use this common EEG data set that was used to try to basically, they would measure the EEG of patients, while the patient was looking at certain images, or the subject was looking at images, and they would try to predict which image they were looking at based on the brainwaves. These researchers from Purdue University tried to replicate the study and couldn't. And so they went back into the methodology and everything. What they realized was that the people training this model, the study had failed to randomize the order of images. So all the images were being presented in the same order to the groups of patients. What that meant was the timing of the EEG, for example, this is where the data leakage occurs. Essentially, the timing of it would be predictive of which image the patient was looking at. And therefore, you get a boost in performance without actually having to interpret the brainwaves of the patient. Now, what I thought was interesting about this particular example was this quote at the bottom here, which was, "The prior work seemed to have suffered from a disconnect between AI and machine learning scientists and the pitfalls that are well known to neuroscientists." And this brings up an important point around how we develop these tools, and particularly how we can avoid performance failures in going from lab to clinical practice, from bench to bedside, essentially, right? The development of AI tools is inherently a multidisciplinary approach. And I do think we need to focus on ensuring that the people developing these tools, or even developing the data sets, have a thorough understanding of the field, or at least are working closely with experts who are able to identify some of these pitfalls and ensure that when we move into practice, the performance doesn't suddenly drop, we don't fall flat on our face, or people can replicate our studies. So I think these are important things to consider, again, as we look at addressing this particular barrier. But let's suppose that you have a model that is working well, it's performing well on test data sets, it's generalizing. You have ensured there's no data leakage by working closely with your colleagues and making sure that the data is constructed properly. I will say that is still no guarantee for good performance in a clinical setting. And here we're going to start kind of moving into the third barrier I'll be talking about as well, but it does bridge this performance issue. So this was a paper published by Google Health in 2016 in Nature for the development of a deep learning approach for the detection of diabetic retinopathy. And this was planned to be used in Thailand to help essentially speed up the screening process to allow the country to achieve its screening goals for patients. And this model had fantastic performance, 97% specificity, or sensitivity, 93% specificity, and it could give a result in less than 10 minutes. But what we saw about 4 years later is that in the real world, there were actually a lot of frustrations with the performance of this algorithm, not necessarily on its predictive performance as much as its ability to handle real world data. So the deep learning model had actually been trained on very high quality scans, which again is a very reasonable thing to do when you're developing a machine learning model. It was designed to ensure accuracy, but by doing so, it basically had a threshold of quality in its processing of the images, and it would reject any that had fell below a particular quality. But in the real world, it actually turned out that quite a few cases fell below that threshold, causing a lot of frustration for the end users, which we'll go into that in the next barrier. So really what this particular example, I think, illustrates is the need to understand perhaps the disparity between some of the data sets we use in the lab that have been highly curated, and perhaps what the data actually looks like in clinical practice, particularly as you look at the whole ecosystem for image-guided therapy. We look at, say, differences even between manufacturers of scanners, or field strengths of magnets, and all these different variables that can exist, just to name a few. How do we ensure that our algorithm is going to perform when it begins to see data that falls maybe outside the quality range or has been acquired slightly differently? So all practical things to consider. And I'm sure, again, this is at the top of mind for a lot of people, but I think this is an important barrier for us that we need to ensure we're taking the right approach with. All right, finally, the last barrier is it executable? And this really comes down to the practical implementation of your tool within clinical practice. This quote comes from this paper, Inconvenient Truth, about AI in healthcare. And that inconvenient truth is that the algorithms that feature prominently in research literature are in fact not executable at the front lines of clinical practice. And this, I think, is an important one to consider, especially when we understand, say, the fragmentation of healthcare IT, or the different clinical environments, the huge variety in clinical environments that exist across countries and different institutions. We need to really, off the bat, really early on in the process of developing AI, be thinking about the practical application of this tool. So let's go back to that diabetic retinopathy tool. I'm going to give Google Health actually quite a bit of credit here. They actually went and did a study of that tool, they call it a human-centered evaluation of the tool within the clinics in Thailand. And it was interesting that the results that they saw, or the factors that they attributed kind of issues with performance to. One was environmental differences between clinics. So what they found was some clinics had dark rooms where the retinal scan could be performed, which resulted in higher quality images, less lighting bleeding through. But not all clinics had that, and that's just a practical reality of the environments. And so how do you handle that, that sort of variability? There were certainly workflow differences between clinics. They described some as having a factory assembly line sort of approach, just one after the other. Others would kind of have education sessions and then handle patients in groups. And so these are different considerations in terms of how many rejections that these people are going to put up with in terms of the image quality. Same thing with high clinic volumes. These are busy clinics. Again, how much frustration are people going to put up with? This was an interesting one. I already mentioned the image quality issues, things like the presence of artifacts, blurs, dark areas, preventing the algorithm from scoring them. But this is a bit more about study design, I will say, that they observed was the study design was such that if the image was rejected, they had to refer that patient to an ophthalmologist. But the issue was that that image could have still been graded by the nurse, allowing them to assess it before determining whether the patient should be sent to an ophthalmologist. And so that was certainly a frustration around the study design and the protocol that was applied. Consent process for patients was brought up. And again, another important one, internet speed and connectivity. Can you always assume that your users or the clinical practice is going to be able to send large amounts of data over the wire in a timely way and in a reliable way? So this was a quote from one of the authors. Currently, there are no requirements for AI systems to be evaluated through observational clinical studies, nor is it common practice. This is a problem because success of a deep learning model does not rest solely on its accuracy, but on its ability to improve patient care. And I think this is a really important point, especially that last bit, which is we need to focus on what the desired outcome is of our AI tool, which is ultimately to improve care. And that happens within a complex clinical environment, and we have to take that into consideration. So this brings up some questions that can be used when trying to implement AI at the front line. Do healthcare organizations have the infrastructure to implement the tool in practice? I like to say, if your algorithm requires a full patient history, is that available at the time that the decision is being made? And do you have access to that data in a real world environment? Or do you have to change which sorts of features you allow into your data set? Is the AI tool integrated seamlessly into the clinical workflow? This is certainly something I observed while developing clinical tools in a variety of settings, is if you require the user to do additional steps, go to an additional website to re-enter patient information, you're not going to see the adoption and uptake that you would hope for, even if it is a fantastic tool, because these are very busy clinical environments, and we have to take into account that as we're designing these tools. Is it provisioned or available at the time and location of decision making? Is it available in a timely manner? Does it provide a recommendation rather than just an assessment? This goes, as we'll discuss, more into the decision-making process of the physician, but I think we need to understand what is going to be most valuable. And in fact, questions like this actually determine which sort of algorithms we can use for that clinical problem. If we have to provide a recommendation, something with confidence intervals or probabilities, well, then that, we have to select our training methods or our algorithms appropriately. And maybe focusing a bit more on the human level of things, do incentives support the existing ways of working? By which I mean, you could develop a fantastic tool, you could develop the best user interface and the most integrated tool, but if there's no incentive to, for example, pay for it, or if there's no incentive to use it because the pay is such that it's better to not know the outcome, this is unfortunately some of the real world things that we need to consider. I'm not saying anything new here. I realize that. If we go back to research on clinical decision support systems, which have been around a long time, we can see, for example, 2003, 2005, not that long ago, but certainly before the advent of kind of this AI boom, that people have been looking at the factors that can improve the success of clinical decision support systems in clinical practice. And I would really recommend you go through and maybe take a look at some of these papers, which, while they were not using perhaps as technically advanced tools as we have today, they were very much focused on the practical implementation of these. So I have just spent the last about 35 minutes haranguing all the issues with AI and machine learning and all the barriers. Do I have anything hopeful to say? And yes, I do. So how can we realize the full value of AI within healthcare? To be honest, I think we should stop, I think maybe the first thing is stop thinking about AI and start focusing on maybe something a little different. I think we need to take a holistic approach to creating data-driven tools that improve clinical decisions. That's really what we want at the end of the day. We want to improve clinical decisions, to improve patient outcomes. We want those to be data-driven so it can be personalized to that patient. So our primary focus should be on the clinical decision that needs to be improved. And this is why we at Cohesic have taken up the term decision intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. And we're not the only ones. I'm not the one who came up with that. There's a chief decision intelligence officer at Google who is certainly the evangelist for this approach, and I certainly agree with a lot of her work and others in this field. What do I mean by that, though? So we really need to be focusing on analyzing the decision-making process in order to determine the right technical approach. I try to avoid cliches, but I will use one. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I think that certainly applies to AI and machine learning. And even within AI and machine learning, to particular types of algorithms that we gravitate towards because it's the ones we know, or it's certainly the coolest and best available. But we should maybe take a step back, think about the decision-making process, and allow that to guide how we approach the technical development, validation, and implementation of these tools. So let's think about this for a little bit. Let's think about availability of data. And I've indicated in here, in brackets, some of the other disciplines that we can kind of bring in. So this is actually around data engineering a bit. I already said this. Does the prediction require the full patient history, for example? Do you need to reach into the EHR and grab things? Is that feasible? Is that available within the clinical environment? Going back to the retina examples, are the data collected in the same environment each time, or do you have a highly variable environment? Are all the data always available? Again, kind of repeating myself. Do you have consent to access the data? Things to consider. If we think about the clinical decision environment, how quickly does the prediction have to be made? Do you have time for this to be sent off to a cloud server and processed and maybe have a manual review and sent back, which is, again, some of the secret sauce behind technology out there these days? Or does this need to be an immediate response? Does this need to be made in the clinic or in the radiology room or at the operating table? does this need to be going more into decision criteria analysis? Does this need to be a recommendation or a prediction, which we already stated? Does it need to be explainable to the clinician? Explainable AI is certainly something that has come up, or explainable techniques has been an important consideration over the last while. So with all of that, the final question, I think, also to start with is this prediction valuable to the decision-making process? I would say, again, we work in the cardiac imaging space, where some of the work that we're doing at Cohesic is looking at how do we predict heart failure, or the risk that a patient will have a heart failure admission to the hospital over the next 60 days. If the prediction you're providing is completely obvious, for example, it's just identifying patients that have a LV ejection fraction less than 35%, and essentially it's going, yep, these patients have heart failure. Well, that's already obvious to the clinician, and it's not really providing them additional information. So that's not what we've done. We certainly are trying to identify patients that would not be identified by the physician. But again, it's important to talk with those experts, understand them, understand the decision-making process, and move forward from there, which brings us to the next point, which is that a decision intelligence approach really involves stakeholders early on in order to ensure that we're delivering value. This is something that certainly, referring to those 85% of data science projects that fail in business, I would say this is probably one of the biggest ones, which is no interaction with the decision makers. And this is not a siloed activity. This is something that should, at the very beginning, when we're thinking about implementation, include input from the decision makers about how they would like output to be conveyed, what are the requirements, are there common pitfalls, again, that we should be aware of scientifically, clinically? And also, I'm going to say, understanding the healthcare IT environment. This is getting very practical. This is very much, you have an algorithm and you want to deploy it and commercialize it, but the thing is that you're going to have to deploy it within a healthcare IT environment, right? Can it be integrated into the clinical workflow? Do you have, for example, FHIR or HL7 interoperability capabilities within your system to create that integrated workflow? Does the hospital have compute resources, available? Do they have, for example, GPUs, or are they even willing to allow you to use public cloud providers due to security concerns and risk and privacy concerns? These are all very practical considerations. But if you assess them early on in the process, again, taking this decision intelligence approach, saying, okay, this decision is made in this clinical environment, it has these requirements, this is the variability we're seeing, this is the availability of data, and working all the way back to inform the technical approach that you take, I do think that you're going to be able to improve the success and the execution of your tool within the clinical environment. So, in conclusion, successful implementation of AI in healthcare is challenging. I think this is something that we probably knew, but certainly something that we're continuing to see. And I've identified three significant barriers. The lack of high quality labeled data sets that are appropriate for our patient population of interest. I'll say discontinuities, or this AI chasm in performance as we move from the lab to clinical environments, and also ineffective execution within the complexity of clinical practice. So I advocate for a holistic approach that's focused on really the decision that's being made and how we can deliver value to the decision makers, and allowing that to guide the development and implementation of our tools, so that we can, again, achieve the goal of improving care and outcomes for patients. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Again, it was a privilege to be able to give this lecture, and I am happy to take any questions.
Well, Jordan, thank you very much for what I'll call a sober look at AI in healthcare. And it is so important to have these talks, because if we just have the hype, then we're doomed to be disappointed, and we in fact doom the field with unrealistic expectations. So we do have a few questions, but before I get into everybody else's questions, I get to ask my own, which is the beauty of being the moderator. So as someone who works within a hospital research setting, what and hospitals really are they hold a lot of the data. I think there's a lot of lack of clarity on the best way for them to participate, to help grow this field, to improve patient care, as well as perhaps help Canadian businesses. So what can hospitals do to participate in a meaningful way in this space?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I think having worked with a variety of hospitals in multiple markets now, um, what I will say as a hospital is, even in Canada, it's still a business, right? It's still something that it has to deliver, has a job to do. It has to deliver care. So I think it's actually, I'm going to change the question a little bit, which is it's a little bit of a mutual exchange, right? So I think, again, I'm going to harp on this decision intelligence thing. I think actually going to the hospital and asking, listen, what are the problems that you are facing? For example, let's take heart failure admissions in the US and the transition to value-based healthcare, where they are trying to find ways to keep patients out of the hospital for the patient's good, but also because they're not going to get reimbursed. This is a problem that they're trying to address at population level. And I think a hospital is going to be much more incentivized to help out if you say, listen, I can at least begin to address this problem. And then with that request, then what the hospital can do, I think, to really support is begin opening up some of those data stores, removing some of the siloing and barriers that exist for data access. I know a lot of times the issue with proceeding with a machine learning approach, for example, I'm doing one with some epilepsy researchers right now, is not the machine learning aspect of things. It's actually just, how do we get access to the EEG data in a scalable way? How do we get access to the MRI data in a scalable way that doesn't require a researcher manually going through and pulling data out of the archive system? So honestly, I think starting at the basics, what's the value that the hospital needs to meet their incentives, and then from there, probably the first step is creating easier pathways to get access to data. So.
Okay, thank you. So now I'll switch to some of the questions being asked by the observers. So first, can you bring an example of a successful decision intelligence, and how is the approach different from the traditional AI method?
Yeah, so I think, again, this is a kind of a term that is, and again, you could make it interchangeable with business intelligence, say, and things like that. I think the key differentiator is decision intelligence. I would say is kind of like good AI, and basically AI development done correctly, right? It is AI is not an approach. It's a set of algorithms or a set of tools that we have. I think decision intelligence is trying to describe a much more holistic approach to it. And so I would say that if you look at, I guess in some ways, HeartFlow's example of looking at coronary artery disease and having that available to clinicians and really focusing on providing a good visualization to communicate that, I would say, is a good decision intelligence approach, which has some limitations, but that would be the kind of an approach I think has been very successful for them and has been very useful for clinicians. So.
Wonderful. So another question, how do we start to address issues with AI algorithms trained on rules based on outdated guidelines? Update lag, more practically, if these guidelines are not followed by all clinicians.
Yeah, this is, I wish I had a silver bullet answer for this. It's a tough problem. And in fact, going back to the IBM Watson example and why actually they failed to provide value for cancer patients. It was actually this exact problem. So what they found is they started with real world data, but the guidelines kept changing. And so they actually ended up moving into using synthetic data that was based off well, we won't go into that, but essentially it just, and which created a generalization problem because it didn't reflect the real world. And that was really this exact issue here. And so what you're talking really about is non-stationarity of data, right? That's the fact that, physiological processes largely remain the same, but how we treat things don't. And so how I would actually handle that, I've done this before, again, looking at epilepsy, AED medications, is being aware of when guidelines have changed, for example, or introduction of new, say, pharmaceutical treatments. And that's really the first step, understanding that, because that can create a huge confounding issue. It's almost, I won't say data leakage, but it's definitely an issue of over that time period, there were changes in how care was performed or what was available. And so at the moment, all I can say is be aware of that, handle that, and then maybe, I think maybe some of the reinforcement sort of learning approaches that are coming that are a bit more of real-time training of an algorithm with new cases might be interesting. But there's FDA issues around that and around that as well. So it's never easy. So.
Yeah. None of these are easy questions for you, and I think that kind of really points to your talk that there are a lot of hurdles ahead. So the next one really gets to the lack of labeled data, and the question is, what do you think is the solution to that? And then how do you feel about reinforced learning approaches or automatic data labeling approaches and their limitations?
Right. Yeah. So I would say, prospectively looking forwards, and I'm not giving a company talk here, but I will say this is something that we're trying to address at Cohesic, is to create software platforms that replace things like free-form dictation, for example. I would say is a form of, I'll call it data capture, that exists, but really what you're creating is an unstructured data set that you then have to go back and do things like NLP on to try to extract clinical terms, and there's huge variability and errors. So if we can create systems that instead collect that labeled data during the course of clinical care, I think it's a win-win all around. You reduce errors, you begin to collect data, you can provide quality control. There's lots of value there. So that's what I'm actually betting on that approach, developing that software. In terms of existing data sets, though, I do think things like natural language processing, for example, or unsupervised methods or semi-supervised methods are good ways to begin to, say, leverage existing labeled data that we can, kind of scale in a semi-supervised way, or NLP to extract clinical terms. I think reinforcement learning was mentioned there. I think the issue there is more thinking again down the road about implementation. I would say regulatory bodies have not yet quite figured out how to approve algorithms that are constantly changing, given that they are trying to require certain performance. So I know that's a rapidly, the regulatory area is rapidly changing, but I think right now there are some difficulties in practical implementation there. So.
Yeah, and what I've also seen are larger companies who are just throwing money at it. So effectively throwing money at clinicians to annotate data.
Yeah, that's again, kind of going back to the ghost workers behind the scenes of just having people go through and label it. That's also, if we need a human level cognition to be able to identify it, to create human level cognition, well, I think that I don't know how to get around that. So, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Last question we have here is I think it really comes down to it's a researcher who is inquiring about the funding environment for AI applications in medicine.
Yes, I've been out of academia for a little bit, but I am still involved in some grant processes. Excuse me, what I will say is there seems to be a good focus of funding institutions on applications of ML and AI. I will say what I have seen over the last 8 years ish is that it went from, why are you using machine learning? You should just use standard statistical techniques that we all know, to now if you submit a paper or something that doesn't have machine learning, people are wondering why you didn't use it. Again, maybe a bit of the hammer looking for a nail sort of thing. what I will say around funding, if I was to kind of bet on the trajectory, is that people are going to start asking, or the reviewers are going to start asking, essentially, what is the do you have a plan for the practical implementation of this, or how are you going to ensure that this is going to provide value in the future and not just become a paper that's published in a journal and never goes anywhere? So I think, and that in particular, I'm referring to the application of AI, not necessarily the development of new AI methods, which I think is a totally different, if you're developing a new type of deep learning, that's a whole different thing. But if you are applying deep learning in medicine for clinical application, people are going to want to, I think, have you thinking a bit more about that innovation pathway, which I think Innovate, of course, is highly focused on. So.
Yeah, no, and that's actually the perfect segue into part of Innovate's mission, which is I mean to build this network in image-guided therapy employing AI in Canada, and by providing funding to collaborations generally between industry and academia to move this forward. And we are very much focused, as you said, on getting algorithms, getting AI employed within the image-guided therapy space, because there's so much opportunity there, and a lot of the issues that you brought forward are focused on the quality of the data versus on the availability of AI algorithms. So I completely agree with that. Two more questions and 2 more minutes. So let's see if we can get through these. Right. So what are the important regulatory implications of commercializing some of these AI algorithms? Okay. That's $1 million question.
Literally. So not going, standard disclaimer, I'm not a regulatory lawyer or regulatory person, so I'll provide my high level view. I would say the rule of thumb is if the output of the algorithm is such that the prediction is explainable to the end user. So the doctor could essentially come to that conclusion or understand how it came to that conclusion very clearly, and then provide their own essentially informed decision from that prediction. You are not necessarily a regulated device in that case. If on the other hand, for example, let's take it as, you're using deep learning on images, and at the end you're saying, yes, there is, cancer present, and that's kind of why you provide that, you do have to go through regulatory approval to demonstrate the efficacy of that, and that, to basically show its performance and measure that through trials. So I would definitely, that is an ever-changing topic though, so certainly keep up to date on the FDA regulations.
Yeah, and we know both the FDA and Health Canada are putting a lot of effort into this area and trying to get ahead of it. Yeah. Last question, is there a rule of thumb for helping determine how much data is needed to train a supervised neural network? More than you have, is that the answer?
Yeah, always more data. I mean, that's always the answer. A priori, being able to say I need 500 samples, I might not be the most qualified person to answer this. But based upon my research and experience, I would say there isn't kind of an a priori way to say I need this much. I mean, sample size is usually determined by kind of, again, the effect you expect to see, as well as population characteristics, as well as the number of features that you're going to be using. What I do know is that if you begin doing the training and are looking at essentially your performance metrics scaled based upon your sample size, you should start to see some asymptotic performance. So basically it'll start leveling out, at which point you know that adding more data is probably, with that approach, is probably not going to get you any farther. So I think you can kind of figure out when you're done, but I don't know if a priori you can figure out how much you need to kind of reach that point. But again, I might not be the most qualified person to answer that. So.
I'm going to flip that around as a final question. Is there a number below which, if someone comes to you and they say, I want a neural network to train this data and I have X data sets, where you laugh because you know that there's no
that is a good question.
No way that there's enough data there.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, honestly, but there's always a practical consideration. So I'd say, if you're talking less than 100, less than 200 patients worth of data, I would say you probably need to be rethinking it. I have done other ones that are, preliminary feasibility studies with, say, 200 patients. But to be very frank, if you look at publications, accepted research publications, you look at their sample size, you will actually see some fairly low sample size values in there. So I think, again, this comes to the second barrier around performance. Well, it's a combination of first and second. You can get away with low sample sizes, and you can probably get some performance and some signal. The question is going to be, as you expose it to more data, are you going to be able to maintain that performance, or are you going to see a large amount of variance in your model? Yeah, it's a tough question, though. I mean, and of course, the availability of data makes it very pertinent. But I'm sorry, I can't give more concrete numbers. Very dependent on the problem. So
it is greatly appreciated. So, Jordan, thank you very much for giving this this very interesting talk today. I think it provides a lot of reality out there, and really points to the issues that exist. And let me just say, so next week we have our next lecture, which is by Dr. Mohammed Mamdani from Unity Health Network, and that will be also Thursday at 5 o'clock. If you have any questions about the lecture series or anything else associated with Innovate, you can go to our website at Innovate.in, of course, AITI in there, and the T for therapy. .ca, or email us at innovate@sunnybrook.ca. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much.